It will come as no surprise to anyone here that the Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 1324 teaches that the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. For Eucharistic adoration has always been part of the miraculous medal novena here at Emmanuel. By the way, our Tuesday night novena was started over 50 years ago by Father Paul Wagner, the pastor of Emmanuel. But as impressive as that is for us who've had the privilege of carrying on that legacy, the history of Eucharistic adoration in the Church goes back more than 1,600 years, when St. Basil, a doctor of the Church, would retain a portion of the Eucharist consecrated at the Mass in a dove-shaped container and suspended it over the altar. In the Eastern Church, an early type of luna, which the sacred species is placed in, is laid upon the altar with a cloth covering it, in keeping with the Eastern Church's custom of veiling from human eyes those things that are deemed sacred. St. Francis of Assisi is credited with starting Eucharistic adoration in Italy in the 13th century. Soon thereafter, Pope Urban IV instituted the Feast of Corpus Christi. And St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of the Church, composed the hymns we chant every week, O Salutaris Hostia, which translated into English is O Saving Victim, which we chant at exposition, and Tantum Ergo, this great mystery, just before benediction. So central to the faith is the Blessed Sacrament that the Catechism further states the other sacraments are bound up with the Eucharist and are oriented toward it. Now, I was curious as to the manner, that is to say, in what way the other sacraments were bound up in the Eucharist and oriented toward it, as the Catechism states. And so I looked a little bit and found the answer in a quote from the Council of Trent in the 16th century. Trent taught that while, quote, the other sacraments do not have the power of sanctifying until someone makes use of them, in the Eucharist, the very author of sanctity is present before the sacrament is used. For before the apostles received the Eucharist from the hands of our Lord, he told them that it was his body that he was giving them, unquote. Trent was affirming the real presence of our Lord in the most holy Eucharist. And it is that real presence that I would like to explore a bit tonight. What is it? What do we mean when we say real presence? Certainly it's a mystery. But something being a mystery doesn't mean we can't know anything about it. It just means we can't know everything about it. And it's often instructive, if we cannot say precisely what something is, to penetrate into the mystery somewhat at least, we can explore what it is not. And that's just what we're going to do. You might recall the Christmas gift for parishioners a few years ago here at Emmanuel was a book by Dr. Peter Kraft called Jesus Shock. A rather strange title, but the main thrust of the book is Eucharistic adoration. I highly encourage you to read it or reread it, for it has many profound things to say about the faith on a number of different levels. But one that was quite striking for me was Peter Kraft's probing of just what the real presence is. Is it a physical presence, or is it a remembering? A spiritual presence, if you will, or some combination of the two? Now, it is an incontrovertible truth, a doctrine of our faith, that at the consecration, the bread and wine ceases to be bread and wine and becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord, Jesus Christ, really and truly present in the Eucharist. Tonight we're exploring what this presence means, and we'll do so by using an illustration from Dr. Kreif's book. The illustration considers whether by the presence of a person we mean a spiritual presence, a physical presence, or both, or maybe even something more. Let's say, for instance, I'm walking down the street and accidentally bump into you. I knock you down, but I don't recognize you and merely utter a sincere "I'm sorry" without seeing your face. You're not really present to me, even though you're certainly physically present. You're not present to me because I don't know who it is I just accidentally knocked down. So then, the real presence of a person is not just a physical presence. On the other hand, if I'm thinking about you personally, even loving you, both my will and with my will and my emotions, but you're thousands of miles away from me, that's not real presence either. You are, in fact, physically absent, though in a certain sense you can be said to be spiritually or mentally present. But even so, real presence cannot be a mere mental presence, a presence in the mind or emotions, if you will. And neither is it a combination of the two. For if I believe you're 1,000 miles away, and I'm thinking about you and thinking loving thoughts about you, and I happen to bump into you in the street and knock you down and say I'm sorry but don't know that it's you, that's not a real presence either, even though you're both physically and mentally present. Real presence then includes both physical and mental presence, but there has to be something more, doesn't there? And it's hard to define what that something more is. It can be shown but not easily defined. It can be pointed to, but you can't really draw boundaries around it. It's a mystery. I think part of this something more in the mystery of the real presence is recognition. Recognition of the person in whose presence we are. I didn't recognize it was you who I accidentally knocked down, so I missed your real presence. Recognition is what is missing. Recognition was missing in many of those who lived with Jesus, who talked with him, who knew him personally but didn't recognize him as the Messiah, as God himself. There were many more who didn't recognize Jesus for who he was than the apostles and disciples who did. As a consequence, many didn't experience his real presence, though God incarnate, body, blood, soul, and divinity stood before them. In the Garden of Gethsemane, after our Lord's resurrection, it was recognition that was missing in Mary Magdalene when she thought she was talking to the gardener rather than our resurrected Lord. He was physically present, but his real presence was not apparent to her. But in what happened next, we find a pearl of wisdom, a pearl of great price, if you will, that can sustain us through the desert of this life, through all our trials and tribulations, until we reach our eternal home. When Mary did recognize our Lord and thereby entered into his real presence, she fell at his feet and worshiped him. She held on to him and wouldn't let him go.